victim. They have been wronged by her. When I used to do evaluations in the probation department, the guys would come in and it was a kind of a common story, and they would say, well, she's bipolar and she ain't on her meds, right? And so that's what happened. She was losing it, and I was restraining her, and then in some kind of way there was a Lego, and she fell over the Lego, and then fell over the chair and down the stairs. And it was like this very unlikely series of events. But he believed that. I'm saying that's right. I'm not saying I agree with it, but he believed that. That was his truth, right? And so in counseling, that's if you're working with offenders, that's part of what you're working on, is what his version of truth is in those. But oftentimes the lack of social support comes in a very different way, and it sounds like this. She may call out to someone and say, hey, this bad thing's happening in my relationship, right? He's this or that or the other. And one of the ways in which we fail to support each other is when you get that call and you say, girl, you should be thankful that he is not cheating on you, because my husband, my boyfriend, or at least he doesn't, or girl, he's got a good job, you should really be thankful, or y'all just got a new house, are you really sure? And so one of the things that we do in those conversations is we fail to support. So even when people reach out, sometimes when they've been isolated, they reach out, and sometimes we invalidate or fail to support them. And so then what happens is that true north part, she goes back and says, well, my friend was right. I mean, we did just buy this house. Or, my son's in 7th grade, and a divorce would be really bad. Or, and so instead of helping her kind of think in different ways about it, it serves to reinforce and keep her in those circumstances. Yes, I saw it on there and I was like, where is it?
What would be a good thing to say to like a friend then? Because obviously saying what you said, or saying like, well, why don't you just leave? Obviously it is not like the best thing. So what do you say when a friend reaches out to you?
So I want to be careful about that. I want to be careful about that because there's not one magic thing that you say. So here's a few things to think about. After today, you know that isolation is a part of what's happening. So if someone is reaching out to you, that's actually a pretty good thing, right? And so if you work to convince her that he is a sorry SOB over and over again, what that does is, although good intention, it puts her in a position to defend him to you. And so now she and he are on the same side as opposed to you and her on the same side. Does that make sense? So instead of tearing him down, one of the things to remind her of is the opposite of all the things that he's saying, right? And so you know, because it's in here, but you know that he's complimenting and building up and then also just tearing down, right? And so sometimes what people really need is an outside perspective to say, you deserve a healthy relationship. You deserve a husband, man, boyfriend, father of your children, whatever, that doesn't call you names or that builds you up and doesn't tear you down. And so to remind someone that we are all worthy of dignity and respect. Now what happens is, where some more doubt comes in, is none of us are perfect in relationships. And so people say, well, I did stay out late, or I did get drunk that one night, or I did sleep with so-and-so 5 years ago, or whatever that thing is. And so that further convinces her, because she's done this thing wrong, that somehow there's some deserving of at least a fraction of this bad behavior on his part, right? And so one of the things that's a bit powerful is, regardless of what you've done in your relationship, nobody deserves to be hit. Nobody deserves to feel scared in their house, right? And so that's true regardless of what you're doing or what you've done, right? All right, and then the other part is to remember this is a process, not an event. And so she will leave him, and you'll go, thank you, Lord. She's seen the light. And then she'll call you and say, oh yeah, we moved back in together. And you'll go, oh, you've got to be kidding me, right? If you express that frustration to her, you aren't going to say anything she has not already thought herself. You are not going to tell her anything she has not already shamed herself for, or felt guilty or dumb or stupid about. So one of the things is just to remind someone that you are there and that you will be there. And then in these households, when you think about the children and families, is that they're working through a process, and some of them are working to heal and are in hope, and some of them are working in more exit strategy, moving him out or away for health and function in that sort of path. And so depending upon where people are, regardless of where people are, maybe it's a better way of saying that, they still need those outside sources to reach out to and to not have you frustrated with them. So one of the things that you might, if you were sort of, if it were my case, right, and if my husband were telling me, if you leave me, I will, take our daughter, I would want you to understand that I do want to leave, but I want my daughter more. And so if you get frustrated with me for going back, you're going to miss a huge piece of why I'm going back in. You will not understand. I will not feel understood. And what I might do is stop talking to you, right? And so then guess who I'm talking to? Him. All right, I'm getting towards my time, so I'm going to finish up. Legal issues. Court documents are written above a 12th grade reading level. I have good education behind me, and I look at court documents and go, I don't know what some of this stuff means. I need a thesaurus, and there's no need for that level of complication. Criminal justice system is complicated. Child Protective Services, DHS is complicated. And so people are not always familiar with these things. And so threats, real or imagined, I'm going to call the cops and tell them blah, 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 and they're going to come arrest you. If you don't know if that's possible, that's scary, right? Immigration is certainly a huge part of the conversation now. People are afraid, real or imagined. If English is not your first or native language, all of this becomes far more difficult. Or if you do not speak English at all, who do you call? How would you know what to say? How will you ask for help, right? And then children is an important part of that. I want my daughter to have a father in her life. I want her to have a healthy father in her life. It is hard to feel like you have broken up a family or have taken a father out of the scenario, regardless of whether or not he's a good father. That's a different question, but that's a really hard idea. And then also custody is another important consideration for folks. And so if I am in the home, I can protect my daughter. So you might hit me, and I'm okay with that if it means that you don't hit her. And so I want to stay in sometimes because I feel that that is my way of protecting my kids, right? And so if we divorce, separate, whatever that thing is, and you have visitation, my kid is with him without me. And so what will happen? What will happen to her? And then chances are there's likely been some threats made, real, imagined, vague. And I'm afraid of what will happen to my kid, with my kid, if he is with her alone or somewhere else or whatever that thing is. And so sometimes people will stay to avoid that situation entirely. And they feel strongly about that because that is their way of protecting their kids. So remember that question I said on that first slide? I said, why doesn't she just leave for the kids? She's staying for them, right? And so that's one of those things we work to try and understand, right? All right, and there's a few other things that matter a lot if you have your own, if she has her own history of trauma or abuse, so things in the household that you saw growing up certainly influence the situation, which is not to say that that's the cause of it, right? So your own mental health issues are a part of the conversation as well. Substance abuse and dependence certainly complicates it. Persons with disabilities and varying abilities certainly complicates it. And so this is just a reminder that all of us enter in the conversation in different places. And so in offender services, it means that something has already happened when my side of counseling shows up. And so oftentimes I would sit aside across the desk from an adult and I would say, where was someone in your life? Where was someone when you were 12, when you were 7, when this thing was happening to you, when you were an adult and first went wayward? Where was someone, anyone, that could have been a voice, a difference, or whatever that thing is? And not necessarily a saving grace, but someone. And so one of my favorite things about coming here is to realize that I'm in a room of those someones, is that you are those people that go out and you can have that conversation with a mom or a dad or a kid or a judge or whomever. And you can sit into some of those opportunities to make a difference, so that there's less maybe adults coming in on the side, more kids going into homes that are healthy and happy. And so I'm always happy to come here and participate as a speaker. It's one of those hope-filled moments. And then final, I remembered the book. I turned around and saw it. So if kind of the nerd style isn't your style, and this is in the memoir category, but it reads a bit like a novel. It's a page turner. If you want to kind of so how does this verbal abuse thing work without definitions and that sort of thing? And this is a fantastic read. It's called If I'm Missing or Dead, and I'll pass that around. And I'm not related and have no financial, ties or what have you. But if you want to see how subtle and insidious it is and how it develops over time and builds a foundation, that's an excellent read for that. There are plenty others of things on the market, but it's one that I certainly recommend. So I'm sorry?
Who's that by?
It's Janine Lattis, Latus, or Lattis, however you say it. It's called If I'm Missing or Dead.
It's on the last slide.
Oh, there you go. Okay. I was about to say, I think it's on here, and I didn't realize you guys had handouts. There you go. It's this last one right here, and then the one I passed on earlier is that one right there. You can live your life without them. They have half-price books in the library, I'm sure. So I'm going to pause, and then if you have time for questions.
We do, we have at least 10 more minutes.
Okay. I'll start over here. So I saw you, and then you, and then there.
So I have a general question. We're not allowed to, in court documents, express opinions.
Right.
So
But facts.
facts. But so if you feel that you're witnessing the escalation, the verbal abuse, et cetera, but there's been no punching.
Yeah.
How do you convey that? Or do you convey it?
So I have some
Or
context,
if
but
the
I won't
answer is
answer
yes,
it like
I would say it's something to talk about with the parent that's experiencing that. It doesn't, unless it's something I saw or heard, I can't really put it in a court report.
Right.
And
Or
so,
how do you, or the kids too?
or if the kids
How do
are
you discuss
telling
it with
you,
the kids?
yeah, I don't know, I'm gonna let the therapist tell
Dad
it.
being a jerk, you know?
Okay. So here's a few things. So one of the things is when you're talking about kids, developmental level matters, right? So what I say to my 15-year-old is different than when she was 4, right? So if you ask anyone at any developmental level, kid, adult, is your home violent? Is daddy abusive? Your definition of abuse and mine are very different. So we're going to pass each other in the conversation when I ask that, right? And I did presentations at high schools, and we would talk about like healthy versus violent relationships. And people's definition of violence is so high. Like, unless there's this happening, it's like, no, violence isn't happening. Does someone shove you? That's violence, right? You can also scare the hell out of someone without ever touching them. And people know that. And so I grew up in small town redneck Texas, and one of the things that the guys in high school did for a little while, somewhat alcohol-induced, or mostly alcohol-induced, but they'd be in the middle of an argument with their girlfriend, they'd be standing by a truck, and they would punch a windshield right by her face. Did he hit her? No. Now that's dumb for a number of reasons, right? So you got to buy a new windshield, whatever. So aside from that, and you may broke your hand, but aside from that part, one of the things that happened is he didn't touch her, but he scared her. And if you hit a windshield like that, what else might you hit, right? And so just because violence isn't happening, just because someone's not being grabbed or pushed or shoved in their house, doesn't mean that they feel safe. So questions about safety tend to bring about people saying what makes them feel safe. Do you feel safe in your relationship is a question people can answer. What makes them feel unsafe may vary, right? So it could be his drinking and not violence, but what makes people feel unsafe in their relationship? And then there's sort of developmental ways in which you might sort of think about that.
This actually might be more for you, Kate, but you were asking about observing verbal abuse, which is an escalation kind of situation, and then how would one deal with it in a court report. Again, you've got areas of concern, you've got your areas of concern, and especially if the children were involved, that has all kinds of psychological implications, which would be needed to be noted. And then the lovely thing is if it's really not germane, there's usually somebody in the supervisory level that can say, hey, that's not it yet, but maybe we'll watch
Right,
it.
and you could put, in a court report, Mr. Smith said X, Y, or Z. Mrs. Smith reported X, Y, or Z. And in my areas of concern, I could put the continued domestic violence between Mr. and Mrs. Smith, but I've got to have a recommendation. So my recommendation may be that they go to counseling. So if I've got a concern, I've got to have
So a different context entirely, but in counseling, we have documentation as well, and there's a particular section that's just facts. No opinion, just facts. And so if one of my student counselors, right, my client came in drunk, that's out. That's an opinion, right? People come in all kinds of ways, and so if you think someone is drunk, don't tell me your opinion, tell me what you saw, which is fact. So the client walked in, so clearly counseling example, the client walked in and stumbled over the chair, was slurring in his speech throughout the 50-minute session, his eyes were bloodshot, and he reported that he had a major headache. Facts, right? Now, while that's happening, could be that, he pulled an all-nighter and, drank 3 Red Bulls and stayed up studying for final exams.
Right.
That could be an explanation, right? But I'm reporting what I saw, so maybe to wrap your mind around like fact versus opinion and how to write that, and I don't know what.
No, that's
documentation
exactly
looks
right.
like,
So
but-
it's only what I can see and what I can hear. And that's all I can report, even if I think he is really not a nice person. He is,
Right.
and anyway, Lindsay had a question and then you, Anthony?
So with the escalation from like verbal to isolation and physical abuse, and you're concerned about it leading to physical abuse, could your area of concern be like Mrs. Smith has not reported a support system? Because that could indicate
Absolutely.
isolation.
That could be your area of concern. Mrs. Smith's continued lack of support, social support, family support, whatever it's going to be.
So I don't know what to write in documents, so that's clearly gonna come in here. But in terms of like that processing, yes. And so when you see someone who had some friends and they don't have any anymore, what happened and how did that happen? And so what happened to her friends? Who's their social support? We all need people that we can go to when we're having good times, when we're having bad times.
And most of the parents and families we're working with are extremely isolated. They've isolated themselves from their families through their behavior, usually related to their substance abuse or their mental illness. And so they are on their own. And that's one of the roles of a CASA, is to help that family identify what their supports are and then connect with them. Now, we don't do it for them, but we might say, hey, did you know you have Medicaid, and the Medicaid bus will take you to College Station for your doctor's appointment. Maybe you can see your mom at the same time. Those kinds of things. So we have resources to give, but we don't do it for them. Does that make sense? Anthony, you had a question?
I just more had a comment kind of related to the investigation aspect of what we're talking about safety and things. So I actually work in survey research, and we have a survey with disabled populations. And one of the things that we want to ask is, are you safe in your home and things like that? And again, getting on the level of someone, if we say, are you abused in your home, they'll probably say no, or things like that. So one of the things that we do is we start off by saying, are there ever any times where you don't feel safe, or where you feel afraid or scared? And then from there, we'll ask follow-up. So, for example, sometimes they'll say, yeah, when I'm walking home from the bus stop at night. And I'm like, okay, that's when a lot of people feel scared. But if they say, when I'm in my room because my bedroom doesn't lock or something like that, then we know, okay, there's a follow-up. So that was just an example that I had.
Good. Eliana?
Can abusers have you experienced, or how often do you see abusers actually reform?
Ooh, that's a tough one.
Because I hate to think it can never be done, but I know it's very.
Yeah, so I wouldn't be in offender services at all if I didn't have hope. So a few things about me is I think that people are saints and sinners. It's not one or the other, it's both. Now your percentage might be way off, right? You might be 97% fool and 3% good Samaritan. Right, now whatever your percentage is a different conversation. But we are both bad and good. Most people would say, oh, I need a college professor, and this is a good person. And my spouse would probably tell you a few things that are like, sometimes she ain't so good, right? So one of the things about offender services, I think, that makes us a bit different if you're doing that is you have to believe that to be true, because if not, what are we doing, right? I mean, then we just cycle people through, or just lock them up. If there's no hope, just lock everybody up, let the prison systems just burst, expand till they burst, and then move on. I have seen people change. I'll tell you a quick story about men and women difference, and then maybe that helps shed some light. With men, I worked in a 6-month program, and the first probably 10 weeks of it is getting them to let go of their own victimization. She did this to me, and denying, and so some people might call that accountability or responsibility. Okay, so she might have been off her meds, she might have been drunk, she might have slept with your brother, and all of those things. Tell me about your part. So I'm not saying that happened or didn't. Tell me about your part, because I can only work with you. And so tell me about your part. What did you say? What did you do? What was your tone of voice? And so a lot of the front work is that part. With females, it's a little bit different, or my experience with that is a little bit different. My females would walk in and say, tell me what happened. And she'd say, well, he came in and he was drunk and I'm just tired of it. And so I sprayed some bug spray in his face, and when he came at me afterwards, whopped him with the frying pan. Like, first day, she's saying, this is what I did, this is what I said, this is how it happened, and then men would be like, well, see, there was this Lego, and it was a leap year, and, and it, so not to make light, but you sort of hear the denial of responsibility is different, and so the work that you do in counseling is a little bit different depending upon where people start the process. So yes, I've seen some positive things happen. One of my favorite stories to tell is when in the town that I worked in, the women's shelter was like a salmon color. And so one of my clients, his wife and children went and lived in the shelter for some time, and he was graduating from the group. So he's finishing the 6-month program, and at the end, we would give them a moment to speak and say, sort of what they learned. And then what they got from other people in the group, right? So it's not just like the curriculum and the counselor that's amazing. It's the people that are in the group. And so he was a very large man, both in height and sort of width. And he was very stoic. And on his last night, he said, what gets me more than anything else is to think about my kids living in that pink house. And he teared up. And he said, I will never do anything to make my kids have to live in that pink house again, right? And so not all relationships end up into, housing services, right? But I'm reminded of that. And then the other thing that I will tell you is one of my supervisors told me this once upon a time. And I was working, my first client ever in the world was a hypochondriac. True story. You come in every week and you have this wild ailment, and then I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? I go to my supervisor, I'm like, what am I going to do? And then I go back the next week and thinking I'm ready, and then you have this other crazy, thing, oh, it's this and that, and I go to my supervisor, what am I going to do? And then I get ready, and the same thing would happen again, and so the client one day comes in and he's really mad at me and he's frustrated and he says, I don't really think I need to go to counseling anymore. And so as a new counselor, I was like, oh my gosh, this is where they find out I should never have been accepted. And I should be a bartender, I knew it. And so my counselor leaves, my client leaves, and I go to my supervisor, I'm like, okay, so the client doesn't want to come back anymore. And he's like, good. I'm like, what? What do you mean good? And he says, the client has decided he's not sick. Right? So I thank you for supervisors, which is the whole point, right? It was a hypochondriac. And then also he doesn't need to be sick to be in a relationship. And so what I saw was all about me, right? And was actually a progress in terms of the client. And my supervisor said to me, he said, there's something you need to understand about progress. And he said, we all want to be around for the harvest. We all want to pick. We all want the sunflowers. We all want the produce. We all want that end. He said, but there's got to be someone at the very front end that's tilling the land. There's got to be someone to plant the seeds. There's got to be someone to water. There's got to be someone to pull weeds for the harvest to occur. So where are you with your client or your family And so you may not be the person to see the outcome, to see the positive, to see someone reform, get better, get on the path of righteousness. But that doesn't make your part any less valuable. I needed someone to see my clients way back when the ground was sparse, in order for me to see them at different parts in the journey. And sometimes I am the person that's looking at the ground going, oh, good Lord. Nothing is going to grow here. Like, nothing is going to grow here. Just want y'all to know. Are you sure right here? And so it depends on where you meet people as to what you see in terms of the progress. And so just because you're not the person that sees the harvest doesn't mean you're not an important part of what needs to happen for the harvest to ever occur. Right?
Speaking of,
I have sort of a complicated question that I'm scared to ask.
I do complicate it.
And I'll explain why I'm asking this in a minute. But how do we, even here, we frame the woman as being almost the passive person in this role.
Mm-hmm.
But I firsthand have seen a woman intentionally instigate this so that she would provoke the man to hit her so that she could report it to bolster her custody thing.
Yes.
So how do we, when we're trying to sift through the weeds here, how do we try to differentiate between something that's maybe more like this versus just a truly volatile, messed up relation? Not that there's ever an excuse to hit a woman, but if you have a woman throwing a sippy cup at your face that's full of juice over and over and over again, eventually you might shove back in reaction.
Yeah.
And so, where's that line? How do we see through all of
So
that?
it's a complicated question, and I appreciate the courage to ask the question. You're a little bit afraid of that. So a few things. So you're going to hear the counselor in me kind of show up for just a second. So one is if someone throws a sippy cup at your face one time and you react, that's a reaction. If your wife, girlfriend, partner, whatever does that every day, and one day you just lose it and barrel her down, that's not a reaction, because you had all 57 times a sippy cup throwing before you lost your mind over it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I can buy it, like if there's a surprise element, like if you do something right now, I'm a ninja for just a second, and whatever happens, sorry, right? But if you do that 57 times, and then I like karate chop your neck, like, hey, I mean, you all watched that happen 57 times. And so one of the things we're responsible for is the difference between a response and a reaction, right? And one of the major differences is time, right? So the first part is that I understand context, because one of the things I believe is if you're trying to figure out why people do what they do, tell me the situation that they're in, right? Because on most days I'm not going to steal anything. But if it comes down to like, I need medicine or my kid's going to die, I'm going to walk myself into CVS and I'm going to be a little misdemeanor shoplifter for a minute if it means saving my kid's life. If you just say steal or no steal, if you're trying to figure out what's going on in a family, the context around it matters. Doesn't excuse, doesn't make right or wrong, but it's context. Why do you do what you do? And if we put sort of what was going on around it, we might go, oh, that helps us understand, right? So I want to be clear. Understanding is not endorsement or agreement. And so when I work with counselors, that's one of the things that we deal with right away, is when you counsel someone, it doesn't mean that you ascribe to whatever they're doing in their life, right? So if someone coming in with a gambling addiction or whatever the families are coming in dealing with, and they sit down and say, I gamble all of my kids' college runs away, just because I'm counseling them doesn't mean I say, oh, cool, I'm cool with that, totally down with that. Yeah. What it means is that I accept the client or the family or whatever as they come to me, and agreement is a different conversation. That's based on values. Acceptance is based on code of ethics and our profession, right? So one of the things is I'm working to build a relationship with whoever I'm with that has the trust so that they can tell me these things. And I'm also holding people accountable and responsible for their behavior. And so one of the funny things that happened to me was at a victim conference one time, and offender services folks tend to maybe not be at those as much because we have our own conferences. And so anyway, I went and they said something about, you're one of those hug-a-thug kind of people. And I was like, no, I don't really hug my clients. We have boundaries, right? And so I don't really hug clients. But the idea is that in order to work with people, you have to feel sorry for them, or you agree with them and can't see another perspective. And so in that scenario, I see two perspectives. What's going on where she's throwing a sippy cup 57 times? What's that? Because that is a problem. And what's going on with him so that 57 times that happened and he's just doing whatever, and then on the 58th, all hell breaks loose. So there's two people to sort out in that situation. Notice I didn't use the word blame, right? So I'm looking at her contribution to the dynamic and his contribution to the dynamic, and I'm saying what's going on and how does that happen and why does that happen, right? So in the passive part, we have agency even when we don't feel like it. We have autonomy. Sometimes it's limited or coerced or forced or whatever, and yet we still have some. And so sometimes what we're working on is helping people who feel passive or that they don't have choice actually see that there are options. Now, I'm offender services in my background, and so sometimes the options I say to my clients are it sucks and it sucks more, and that's what you're looking at, right? It's a bit crass, but it's true. Sometimes you get a choice between something that's not cool and something that's a whole lot less cool, and that's what separates adult from children most days, right? Is that you gotta make a choice. And so you know, people would come in and say, you mean I gotta go to counseling, and if I don't go to counseling I could go to jail? Sucks to go to counseling when you don't want to. Sucks a lot more to go to jail because you didn't go to counseling and all the other, you know, things or whatever that can be alleged.
I have a question. Let's speak, well, it's more like, how do you say it, you observe this. I work with a lot of people over the years, and it's just family of brothers that work with me, there's 3 of them. And, you know, speaking of verbal abuse, there wasn't no fighting then, because 5-year-old brother, but anyway, I guess it was the way they was raised. They didn't know how to talk to people. They were very abusive, and one of them probably been married 7 times. He married in 2016, and he was divorced 6 months later. And they got issues. They just don't know how to talk. They don't, especially women folk. You get around now. It's just, I just figured maybe, you know, I tried to talk to them because we all, you know, they went to school together. They just, I guess that's just the way they was raised in an abusive home.
Yeah, so the home that you grow up in influences.
Right.
So I grew up in a home where my dad worked shift work. And so my dad was either going to work at 5 o'clock or coming home at 5 o'clock. So what that meant is if my dad was going to work at 5 o'clock, he cooked dinner. And then my mom would come home and he would go to work and we'd have dinner. The reverse, if he was coming home around 5, my mom cooked dinner. My entire vision of males and females included my dad cooking and sweeping the floor, right? My husband grew up in a household where his dad couldn't make a grilled cheese if his life depended on it. And yet we're coming together to try and make a marriage work. And it doesn't mean that I'm right, and that what I saw is right, or what he saw is right or wrong. What it means is that influences what I think and believe to be true about marriage, about, you know, who makes grilled cheese, about who sweeps the floor, or whatever that thing is. And so sometimes people, so there's acknowledging context, and then there's sort of using as an excuse, and so I'm careful not to slip into that category. So you're still responsible and accountable for what you do. I'm responsible and accountable for my grilled cheese making skills, regardless of what I saw when I was a kid, and so is my husband, right? So it influences who we are, but I would be remiss to say that it causes. Does that make sense?
All right, it's already 7 o'clock. We've got to let Dr. K go.
Thanks, you guys are great. Great questions. It doesn't matter. I don't keep track. I don't keep track.
All right, well, thanks.
Thank
Let's
you.
take 5 minutes if we can. Remember, there's bathrooms upstairs. And we'll be back. We'll do trauma and the brain when we get finished. Oh, and here's
Oh, yeah, thanks. Oh, of course. I try and I remember. I like your earrings. I don't know how you'll do it.
No, I'm gonna text my boss right now and see if I can switch it, or like try it in the morning.
So is it nap time
So
later
it's like,
today?
yeah, it's like kind of a segmented thing. So I can just be like, oh, can you just switch it? Maybe she'll say yes.
Oh, no. Yeah, no, it's such an important topic, so, and she's a fantastic speaker.
Oh, yeah,
so-
she's always.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for
All
having
right,
me.
well, thanks for
Appreciate
being
it.
here. We'll see you next time. Oh, absolutely. Kat asked a good question. If you read either one of those books, that's good for continuing education, and you get a minute per page. So it's a 300-page book, divide by 60, and that's how many hours you get. Very good. Great.
I know simple math.
We have reading suggestions, can we send them to you?
Yes, yeah, and if it has anything to do with any of the dynamics on a case, child abuse, foster care, we're pretty easy going.
Okay.
Thanks, Steve.
I know, like, next time we'll try to yeah, but then when they get that, I'm gonna do.
They go
Then they just let it all fly. Really get to the shirt.
That's the time.
I would teach that student.
I'm trying to find somebody to do their wedding cakes. They're so expensive. Why are they so expensive?
Because they know you want one.
I literally just ordered the last one.
You ordered what?
The last one.
I'm getting on there.
Already ordered.
I probably should.
We can do pictures too sometimes.
Oh, yeah. Jason brought up a good point. If you haven't had your picture taken, come on this way.
$500 for some cakes, guys? That's a lot. No better?
You have all the companies around here?
Yeah, the cheapest I've got is like 400. That's for a quote. Why? I want to just make some cupcakes. Like, here you go. I don't even like cake. This is for you guys. I want cake, but I don't like paying the money.
You know, you could do a cupcake. No, you could do a cupcake.
Just get like a tier stand and
Yes, you could do some things like that. And then also then some smaller tiers to the side or something like that. Do the,
Oh, that's right.
how much you
I
do
knew
like
you
it.
had told me, but I couldn't remember.
Because really,
I'm not saying it.
Oh, I forgot about that.
Laying in the mud. By the time I finally got it.
I mean, hopefully it's my early wedding, so like I get it. Like I get why you're charging so much.
That's right. That sounds good.
are those private cake companies?
These are cake companies. I've asked people too, and their quotes are like the same.
What about
Oh,
places like
I've
this?
got a lady for you, a local lady. It's called Fabulous Fair. And I will, as a matter of fact, I have her number right here.
All right.
She is reasonable and she's excellent.
You do? What is it? I'll pull it up. I need all of your wedding good things right here and over here too. Any wedding hookups you have, we need them right
We need
here.
them right here.
Thank you.
I think I've got it.
Me, yes. I do
You got it, you got it.
stressing me out.
Oh, I bet. Let's see contacts. Okay, no problem. You know what? It's Fabulous Fair.
I will look them up on Facebook. I'll message you.
That's probably the best.
She like brought, she like have like come to my house and cupcake every time we go outside. And then you went, you want to great. If you don't, like great, but these are yours. Free of charge.
Yeah, because we already know like the flavors. I just want to.
Oh, yeah, that's the same one.
Oh,
good would, it's like they really can have, like just my tree and it's like my tree.
Really? For 200 people? Mine are only 125, and that's what they're asking.
But it was for 200 because we did. A cookie cake.
Did she do the cookie cakes too? Okay, so y'all did two. Okay, because that's what I want too. We want two. Okay. Thank you so much. Jacqueline Giles, guys. Probably super better right now. No, she said that helped. Yeah, it was Are you gonna be here by dessert? Because are you just drinking? Are you
All right, is just about everybody back, I think? Yeah, so the lady's name is Jackie and it's
it was the same lady.
Fabulous Fair. She's the best. The lady that made our wedding cake 25 years ago retired and refused to make me an anniversary cake. I begged, I pleaded. It's the best cake I ever had. I mean, we were on our honeymoon, and when somebody would turn to the other one and say, wasn't that the best cake you ever had?
Oh, yeah, no. But if you're not, like,
Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We're a little behind schedule, but Dr. Kate is always so good, and you guys ask great questions. So that's good. So somebody said let's talk about the assignment for the court report. So your job is to read all the documents in Optima, the affidavit, the counseling, the therapy notes, the psych eval, everything you can gather information from. Watch the videos all the way through the status hearing. The next one is the initial permanency, right? You're writing your court report for the initial permanency hearing. Yes.
Are there any documents in Optimantra that take place after when we would be writing our report?
Probably, but you can use your, probably. But what we tried to do last time was get you to write it for the final, and it got real confusing, and it's not really how it works, so we're sticking with the initial permanency. So do all that, what you got from the role play, and then use that early family engagement report as your guide. You're not going to change the children's situation, you're not going to change the DFPS history, right? That's all good, but then what you will change is, you know, healthy attachments, education, those kinds of things, visitation,
Where they're living.
I'm sorry?
And where they're living.
And where they're living, absolutely. And then you'll also make your recommendations, your areas of concern. Those would be things like, I think, her continued substance abuse, the mom's continued substance abuse, Ben's stealing, you know, that kind of stuff. And then you'll make your recommendations. So your recommendation for Ben, let's say he's been stealing from his aunt, recommendation would be increased therapy. You know, things like that. So, you know, you guys are going to do a great job. Really, everybody always does. Everybody's so worried about it, and then people write great court reports. So try not to worry. Did that clear it up a little bit?
What did you say right before stating the areas of concern?
So you're going to fill out all those headings, healthy attachments, education, visitation, all that. And then for your areas of concern, you can list anything you've witnessed, heard, seen, that you have a concern about. And like we were talking about, somebody may not be hitting, but we really feel like domestic violence is going on. We can say our area of concern is a continued, I don't even know how to say it. You can say turbulent, but the continued relation, I would even just say the relationship between Mr. and Mrs. Smith, which has, it appears to be this and this. Okay, let me get Ella and then Jennifer.
You said we're not changing what?
You won't be changing the age, how old they are, the birthdays, or the DFPS history. That won't change. So that portion will just stay the same. Because that hasn't changed. Jennifer, you had a question? No? Just stretching. Yes, Sandra?
Look at the early family engagement.
Yeah, so you're going to use that as your template. You're going to take out the old information and put in your new information.
Okay.
Update, I should say, you'll update your information.
Okay, it's not gonna,
And speaking of, I am emailing that to you, I'll do it tonight before I go.
I thought it would be this, what you handed out.
It is, that's exactly it.
Oh, this is the EFE?
Yeah, that's the EFE report.
Oh.
Yes, written for the adversary.
Building our report off of this. This is-
Okay.
Okay.
All right, any other questions before we move on? All right, so we're gonna be, well, I thought I got it. Sometimes I do it too fast. So I'm gonna sit, but we're gonna see some videos. Make sure this is turned up. So what we're gonna talk about is trauma. So the first thing it says is, what is trauma? So
That is new.
if you believe it's a crisis, right? That was our definition of crisis when I worked at MHMR, but trauma is pretty specific. Acute trauma, there's acute, chronic, and complex. So acute trauma is exactly what it sounds like, a car accident, a shooting. It's a traumatic one-time event, and it causes acute trauma. Okay? Auto accident, violence in the community, natural disaster. Think about all those folks that went through Hurricane Harvey. And a lot of the people that had been through Katrina moved to Houston and then had to go through it again. So sudden loss of someone the child cares about, those kinds of things. Chronic trauma is exactly what it sounds like when someone has experienced multiple traumas, varying in circumstances. Oop, yeah, there we go. For example, I was abused at home, I got assaulted at school, then I was involved in a car accident. That's chronic trauma. It's over and over and over. And it does have a cumulative effect on the brain, and we're going to see that. And complex trauma refers to the impact that chronic trauma has on their life and developing system. Okay, so it's chronic when I've got things going on. I'm sexually abused at home, I'm assaulted at school, I get yelled at by, it's ongoing, right, is the chronic, as the term indicates. Complex is the effect it has on my brain and my body. Okay? Witnessing a trauma is a trauma. It changes the brain. So those women that are staying to protect their kids, they're not being hit, but they're witnessing trauma, which is traumatic to their brains. The fear causes different chemicals to be released in your brain. We're going to talk about, or the video will talk about that in more detail. So that's important to remember. When we hear that 911 tape that the judge will play, you will see what witnessing violence does to children. Small children, the oldest one is 6. 8 or 6, I can't remember. Anyway, it's really awful. So this is what happens. We have that traumatic event, right? I'm watching Dad be violent towards my mom. It sets off the body's alarm system, and that's your fight, flight, or freeze. They've added that, so for kids, it's fight, flight, or freeze. And adults as well, with post-traumatic stress, it can be the same thing. That releases hormones, mostly cortisol, in your brain, washes over your brain, and you've got traumatic stress. So we watched the movie Removed, right? You saw the trauma trigger. When that happens and triggers her trauma from the past, that cortisol level is raised in the body. They do all really interesting studies with these kids that show their cortisol levels, even when something bad is not happening, are sky high because of the chronic traumatic stress. Okay? So I'm going to show you a video, and I'm sorry it's so bright. The sun must be headed down. I'm going to show you a video on how the brain develops and what happens when trauma happens to the brain.
As recently as the 1980s, scientists believed a child's brain at birth was fairly static, largely predetermined by genetics. Researchers now know that's not true. While genetics clearly play a role, scientists know that relationships and experiences shape the brain. Think of a developing brain like a multi-storied house under construction. In this chapter, we'll explore the basics of brain development and help you understand how early traumatic experiences can design a different house. When we're born, our brains are teeming with more than 100 billion neurons or brain cells. Under optimal conditions, when our needs are met consistently by nurturing caregivers, our brains thrive. These neurons connect in complex and vast networks, much like the electrical wiring in a modern home.
The baby comes with all this wiring, but it's the human interaction, looking into the eyes, being held, hearing the song of my mother, feeling the strong shoulder of my daddy, that begin to make the brain develop in very, very important ways for all of the life skills that will come.
At birth, the lower floors, or the downstairs part of the brain, is firmly wired in place by genetics, allowing a child to breathe, eat, sleep, and heal. Survival functions are rooted here. Very few connections in the upper floors are formed. These more sophisticated parts of the brain govern higher functions: complex thought, reasoning, emotional processing, memory, speech, and most importantly, the ability to regulate our behavior. It takes time and repeated experiences for this circuitry to develop and become hardwired in the brain. When a child experiences trauma, abuse, neglect, or other risk factors, it can skew the wiring of the brain, as well as the structure and the chemistry. The lower, more primitive survival part of the brain can overdevelop from reacting to fear, while the critical upper floors may underdevelop and suffer.
In the book that I wrote with Dan Siegel, The Whole Brain Child, we talk about an upstairs brain and a downstairs brain. For some kids,
Dr. Bryson is a psychotherapist at Pediatric and Adolescent Psychology Associates, Director of Parenting Education for the Mindsight Institute in California, and best-selling author along with Mindsight Executive Director, Dr. Dan Siegel.
the upstairs brain is the more sophisticated part of the brain. It's our cortex that takes a long, long time to develop.